The views and opinions of this broadcast do not reflect the views and opinions of Armed Media, New Productions and its affiliates. Enjoy the show.
Teflon Pan Man. I'm the Teflon Pan Man. Ain't nothing gonna stick on me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to All You Can Eat, the podcast about deliciousness. This is your host, Rob Rosenthal. Welcome, everybody, back to the show. Excited about tonight for a variety of reasons. First of all, we've reached episode 50 of All You Can Eat. And I'm here with you live, as I generally am and like to be, on the 27th day of March in the year 2019. And the weather is getting delicious, so that's exciting. Now, tonight's show, for episode 50, I wanted to do something special, so we have a guest. And she's a special guest because she's a special person. Her name is Gail Simmons, or anybody that has watched food television over the last, let's say, dozen years, 14 years maybe. Anybody who has watched Top Chef knows 16 seasons later that one of the hosts from the very beginning is the lovely and charming Gail Simmons. And so this very morning, today, 27 of March, I sat down and spent a whole bunch of quality time with Gail in Gail's kitchen, talking with her about where she came from, how she ended up where she is right now, which is residing at the judge's table, the first judge's table ever, by the way, in television, at what is essentially the single most successful franchise in the history of food television. I mean, there might have been shows. I spoke about this with Gail. I mean, if you think about Jacques Pepin, for example, the hero, the legend, he was probably on public television for 30, 35 years. But in terms of the vastness, the scope, the size of the audience, the globality, if you will, there's no show that ever has matched in the food business. There's no show that ever matched the success of Top Chef, and so. I spent time with Gail this morning. I'm going to now turn the mic over to our conversation from this morning. And she and I spent enough time that I may have to do this in two pieces. So I will be back with you towards the tail end of the hour. And between now and then, enjoy my conversation with cookbook author, food writer, mother, and judge on Top Chef, Gail Simmons. Everybody, yes, I am here. Gail Simmons.
Hi.
In the house.
Yes.
And
well, you're in mine.
Well, that's the thing I was going to say. It's not like you're in the house. We're in your house.
Yes.
You gotta love
welcome.
That. You gotta love that. So thank you for doing this, first of all, and for and for inviting me over to your kitchen. There's no better place to do a podcast about deliciousness,
I would think,
than in a person's kitchen.
It's a little cozier.
I like it so much. Now, I forgot to. I want to do this too, though, by the way, so that we have two of those.
Sure.
What I would like to say, even before we start, and I've already probably said this to the people who happen to be tuning in, is I knew you before you became super well known.
Yeah, I was just a wee tot.
But I say I liked you. I got to be honest with you. I liked you from the very beginning. You struck me. And I'm telling you, this is someone who doesn't, automatically like people.
Excellent. Yes, no, I'm honored.
As the joke goes, I used to be a people person, but people ruin that for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I liked you because you struck me instantly as being not only charming and warm, but very natural, very yourself.
Thank you.
A lovely person.
Oh, that's appreciated. I felt the same of you. It's funny. We met a long time. We met almost 15 years ago.
I was doing a project for Food and Wine magazine where we were recording the happenings going on over in Aspen at the Food and Wine Festival.
Correct.
Which to this day, I have to say, is still probably one of the foremost, if not the foremost.
For sure it is. Very magical weekend in June every year for Food and Wine.
Fantastic. And I'll probably mention to people somewhere along the way that if they want to read about it, I ended up writing a whole story about it. So but I think we met right like before the time that this that your kind of more public life became.
Yes, absolutely. So I ran the Food and Wine Classic in Aspen for Food and Wine for 5 years, and it was while I was running the Classic that I started doing Top Chef, and my job and life changed. But you and I met because while I was directing the Classic, we were preparing for our 25th anniversary.
I see, right.
And
the Classic.
Yes, and you came in to help us produce a whole bunch of video content about it.
That is exactly right. A little movie that was about the Classic. Now,
I want to go back and watch it. It's been a long time. Anyway.
Speaking about going back, I always start these conversations with people from the very beginning.
Okay.
And if you go look up Gail Simmons on Wikipedia.
Ooh, I don't always suggest you do that.
I'm just saying
right.
It says Canadian.
Yes.
Okay, so tell people you grew up in Toronto.
I did. It's funny it says Canadian because that makes me sound like I live in Canada.
Right.
But I don't. But I am Canadian. I'm not an American citizen. I have a green card. It's all above board.
Right.
But I grew up in Toronto, Canada, lived in Canada for the first 22 years of my life.
So, and here's the other part of the story that I think, people who know you obviously know this, but for the people who don't, your mom was a food writer. You grew up around not only just everyday food, you grew up around special food.
I did. My mother was an amazing cook. She still is around, kicking, celebrating her 80th birthday this year, actually.
Happy birthday, lovely.
Thank you. I'll let her know you said so. She was an amazing cook, really ahead of her time in a lot of ways because she was interested in cooking and food and cuisines of the world long before that was cool.
Right.
When in the sort of 60s, 70s, into the 80s, when people were trying to figure out how to make food more convenient and faster and quicker, and especially stay-at-home mothers were trying to figure out how to get food on the table and put it in your microwave and all those things. My mother was scouring Chinatown in Toronto, which is very extensive, to find and bring us home interesting vegetables and fruits and seafood. And that was really an amazing thing. At the time, I didn't appreciate it as much as I do now. I wanted, mac and cheese and hot dogs that my friends were eating. Sure. And when you came to my house for dinner, you were getting like zucchini and Arctic char.
Right, interesting stuff. In fact, you mentioned somewhere along the way that people were intimidated to send their kids to your house or to come to theirs.
Yes.
Because they knew you were coming from eating serious food.
It's the blessing and the curse of the fact that, yes, I had great food at home, fresh, interesting food, but truthfully, all I wanted was the other stuff. And no one wanted to invite me to their house for lunch because everyone's parents thought that all I wanted was fancy food. And that's the least of what I wanted. And that remains true to this day. People are, always intimidated to invite me for dinner. And all I really want is like a bowl of spaghetti and tomato sauce.
Well, I just want to make this really easy for you. I am so not intimidated.
Good.
I'd be happy to cook for you.
Good. Well, I know you can cook. So there you go.
I can cook and I would.
But you don't even, but point being, yes. I don't expect everybody to cook. I'm also happy to always jump in the kitchen.
Right.
But food doesn't need to be fancy or stuffy or frilly.
People say to me, and again, I have I have a degree, literally from the same school in French cooking, and like my favorite food in the world by far, if I only had one, would be pizza. Like a slice of pizza.
Pizza's up there.
What's your number one? I mean, I heard you mention like mac and cheese and hot dogs. Like,
that was when I was little. I don't eat them as much anymore.
Now would be like I want like a simple roast chicken.
I'll eat a simple roast chicken any day of the week.
Me too.
I love simple roast chicken. But I also, I really do want a bowl of spaghetti. I want pasta.
Right.
I want, I want French fries and potato chips. I really do.
Right, exactly.
Well, we all just want the carbs, but that's not even true. I want us like a grilled steak with like a spicy chimichurri sauce or something. Or I want, butterscotch pudding.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I don't know.
No, it's fine.
Those are the things I want.
I'm hungry now.
I want spicy chicken wings.
Yeah,
That's really what I want.
I think I have a problem with chicken wings. By problem, I mean like an obsession.
Me too.
By problem, like if there were a self-help group.
Correct.
You know what I mean? Hello, my name is Rob kind of thing.
That's what I'm talking
chicken
about.
Wings. And by the way, I'm going to throw this in. It's so not where I had us going
it's okay.
in our conversation, but that's what
we'll go back.
But here's what I want to say about it. Like recently, and when I say recently, in my case, that's got to be like 5 years. I have been making turkey wings.
Oh.
And here's the
sure in the same way.
The beauty. Not only in the same way, but the beauty of the turkey wings is like it's a chicken wing on steroids.
Yes.
If you like the taste of turkey, you know, here is like 10 or 15 times the amount of meat and skin, and you blast it in the oven with whatever your favorite spice mixture is.
Right.
You're in heaven.
Yeah, you're right.
Beautiful.
Good call. Good call, Rob.
The thing about Toronto, as a sidebar to our conversation about your birth city, is do the Torontans? It's a very sophisticated, city and all that. But do you guys have any kind of competition like with Montreal?
Oh yeah.
You do.
Oh yeah.
So Toronto's
it's like New York, Boston.
Right. That's what I wanted to know.
But it's even more political.
How come?
Because Quebec, Montreal is my other favorite Canadian city. My mother's from Montreal. Okay. My husband is from Montreal. Oh, wow. And I went to McGill.
Keeping it all in the family.
Yeah. So we spend a lot of time in Montreal. In fact, I'm headed there in a couple weeks from now.
Nice.
And I'm in love with Montreal. And in a lot of ways, I love it more than Toronto because culturally it is gorgeous. Scenically, like as a city, it is a much more beautiful city than Toronto. Yeah. It's on, it's built around a mountain that was created into a park by the same person who designed Central Park, Olmsted.
Oh, love that.
So, it is just a glorious city on a river. It's very, very green. It's very, very French, which makes it beautiful. The buildings are very European. The experience of Montreal really makes you feel like you're in Europe, right. But you just flew 45 minutes, exactly right. Which is what's so brilliant. And the dollar in Canada is 30% less than here. And so there's a lot to say.
And you didn't even mention the food.
Well, and the food is bananas in Montreal. Just bananas. It's rustic and it's rich and it's soulful and it's unique. It's French food with this sort of more homey soulfulness, I think, Montreal food. Yeah. The issue between Toronto and Montreal is, besides our hockey rivalry, much like a Boston-New York baseball rivalry, is that, there's sports team rivalries, but there's also a lot of rivalry between sort of the personality of the people. Right. Montrealers think they're much more sophisticated. Sort of historically, Toronto is the economic capital of Canada, of course. And so it's a lot more sort of preppy and it's got a bit of a stick up its butt, a little more. I still think it needs to relax, but it has changed so much over the years. And Toronto now ethnically is extraordinary in terms of its diversity. It's got like 4 Chinatowns now. It's the biggest population of Chinese outside China.
Interesting.
It's a massive city. A lot of people don't know about Toronto, that it is the 4th biggest city in North America after Mexico City, right. LA, and New York.
Wow.
Toronto is next. It's bigger than Chicago.
I did not realize quite how big it was.
It's massive. It's like probably close to 8 million people, and it's very, very spread out, and it was a great place to grow up.
But McGill, where you went to college, that's Montreal.
It's right in downtown Montreal.
Okay, great. Okay, now, so here's what happens, right? And by the way, before I even ask you about how you kind of segued into the business itself, you told me actually. I was going to ask you kind of like what your food memories are growing up, and they are. They're reading kind of interesting things, but
it's interesting because I have a lot of food memories. We traveled a lot. My father's from South Africa. We went back to Africa a lot as children to visit his family.
Johannesburg kind of thing?
His family lived in Johannesburg, although we tried to spend as little time there as possible because Johannesburg
wasn't great.
This was, in the 80s during apartheid, the height of apartheid.
Right.
Still isn't great.
Right.
But it wasn't great then either. So we spent a lot of our time in Cape Town, where a lot of my father's family is, where my father went to university. Beautiful. And then we spent a lot of time on safari. Nice. We spent a lot of time in the Kruger National Park, which is the biggest safari park in the world. Yep. We also spent a lot of time up and down the Cape. My father and I once took a 10-day road trip up the Cape, the Cape of Good Hope, around what's called the Garden Route,
Right.
which takes you from Cape Town up to Port Elizabeth. And we got to know the country very well. My father's family is from a very small town in the center of the country called Bloemfontein. Most people don't know Bloemfontein. The only relevant thing you need to know about Bloemfontein is J.R. Tolkien was born there.
Oh, wow. Well, there you go.
He then went to Oxford. He wrote Lord of the Rings and all of that while he was in England, but he was born in Bloemfontein. That's the only claim to fame I can think of about Bloemfontein. It's only redeeming factor. But so we traveled a lot. My parents were also just travelers, so we didn't just go back to his homeland, but we spent a lot of time. We went to Central America. We went to Israel and the Middle East. We traveled, all over the world, Europe, which was amazing because we sort of always saw it through the lens of food because that was my parents' interests. Yeah. Music and food were very much a big part of my childhood. But interestingly, I never associated food with a career, even though my mother did it as a career for part of my childhood.
Right.
She wrote about food for the newspaper in Canada, and she ran a cooking school out of our home.
Right.
And even so, I think it's partially because as a young woman, you don't want to be just like your mother and you rebel against it. But also she pushed me because she wanted different things for me.
Sure.
She wanted me to be a lawyer or a doctor, like every good Jewish mother.
Right.
So I spent my college years trying to figure out what that was going to be. Mm-hmm. And I searched and I was good at school.
Right.
But there was no way in hell I was going to become a lawyer.
Right.
That I always knew.
Right.
Much to my mother's dismay.
Right.
So it was only after college when all of my girlfriends were going to law school and medical school and going to do a master's in social work or business or whatever they were going to do, because my girlfriends were very, very bright and very hardworking. I was sort of one of the few that were flailing around.
Right.
And I moved back to my parents' house in Toronto with no idea what to do with my life. Mm-hmm. Except that I knew I wanted to write. Mm-hmm. I liked to write.
Sweet.
And I liked to eat.
Right.
And those were the two things.
And you started basically at that point writing about eating.
Correct.
Now, before I even go back to that, I realized it's so easy to talk to you that I am now going to shoot off in a direction just based on what you said. Somewhere I read, they say, oh, Rob, they say I don't do my homework, but I'll say this. Somewhere I read something, and it was the one thing that really stood out. Of all the things that one could read about you.
Uh-oh.
No, it's
It's a deep, dark web. But I don't know what's up there.
Well, we can talk about that.
Yeah, whole other
thing. That's not even what the point is. The point is, you were asked, and I'm reminded of this, by the way, with the whole South African thing. Mm-hmm. Your dad. Where were you in the birth order, incidentally? Are you
I'm the youngest. I have two older brothers.
Okay. Oh, wow. So you're the youngest and the only
girl, and they were much older than me.
Okay. Well, here's what I wanted to say to you. Somewhere along the way, you were asked what 3 things you would want to have on a deserted island. And here's what it is that you said. You said Spotify, beef jerky, and tequila. And I
yeah.
said, oh, my God,
yeah, that's good.
So fantastic. I love that.
I like that answer, too. I'm so glad I gave that answer.
And the reason I bring it back up in this context right here, because later I want to talk about what's on your playlist. But the reason I bring it up here is because I'm assuming that your dad has spoken to you about biltong.
He hasn't spoken. It is a way of life in my family.
So tell people what biltong
Sure.
is.
And I probably said beef jerky only because biltong is hard to find.
Exactly.
But actually, biltong is beef jerky's far superior brother. And I'll tell you why. So biltong and beef jerky all come from the same place. They were methods of preservation of meat before refrigeration, where you would cure and salt and hang and dry your meat. Now, in the case of beef jerky, I'm not totally clear on all the historic details, but beef jerky is usually cured with salt and sugar.
Right.
Beef jerky, my experience of American beef jerky is that it is quite sweet. They have a lot of flavors like teriyaki,
sure, right.
But also they, other plain flavors, but there's often sugar in beef jerky. And so it has a sweetness and it's a chewy, dried meat,
sure.
which is delicious. Biltong is much the same in South Africa, before refrigeration, when they were colonizing the country, they would make cured and dried meat out of all sorts of meat, by the way.
Sure.
Biltong, yes, is traditionally beef. There is a lot of meat consumption in South Africa, by the way. But in South Africa, you can get biltong, Biltong, if in case people don't know how to spell it, you can get biltong in all sorts of African game meat. Ostrich, kudu,
Sure.
And the list goes on. Impala. So I like beef jerky.
Right.
I mean, I like beef biltong,
Right.
chicken biltong, which sounds strange because why would you eat raw chicken? But it is so good.
Really? Okay.
And then ostrich biltong is really good.
Like for people if they wanted to order it on.
Because beef jerky became a thing in the States, and especially places like right here in Brooklyn, it became this sort of like hipster food project.
Oh, wow.
There are definitely a few companies. So for a while, I was ordering biltong on the regular for my father through a biltong place in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure it's called like biltongusa.com or something.
Right.
There is a huge South African population in Toronto. So now there's actually great biltong stores or South African stores that sell biltong in Toronto. So we get it there all the time. But growing up, we used to bring it back by the kilo in huge strips. So pre-cut. It's not shredded like beef jerky.
Right.
It comes in sort of the whole tenderloin. And we would cryovac it, seal it, vacuum seal it, and wrap it in our suitcases and pray the dogs at JFK, because we had to fly through JFK to get home, didn't smell it. And so we would preserve it and just eat it one slice at a time every night and have a savor of it. But the difference, I forgot to say, about biltong is there's no sugar.
Right.
It's just salted and dried meat.
It's pure. There's just something.
It's pure and it's so satisfying.
So satisfying.
That's the long answer. You can now get like Brooklyn. There's a company called Brooklyn Biltong.
Right.
That's at like Smorgasburg, and you can buy biltong now all over the place.
Right.
But growing up, it was such a delicacy in our house.
I was in Kruger. I'm probably going back 10 years with South Africans, and then you wake up early to go on safari like at 8, and then by 4 o'clock you just
it's too hot.
Being so starving, and we pulled up to some kind of like body of water, and they opened up those lovely trucks that your Land Rover type of things, and they take out the following 3 things: gin, tonic, and biltong.
Yes, that's very South African.
I've never been happier.
Well, you know why tonic was invented?
Yes, because of the quinine in it.
For malaria.
For malaria.
Yeah, in colonial Africa.
Well, I don't wish anybody malaria. But
no, but it is perfect. I mean, wow, you really hit the nail on the head there. Gin and tonics were invented because tonic had quinine. And that prevented malaria. It used to prevent malaria, at the turn of the 20th century in colonial Africa. And so it helped ward off malaria. I am strangely allergic to quinine.
Oh.
I used to take, when we would go, I would take quinine medication. That was what we would take to make sure we didn't get malaria when we were there. And I used to have very bad allergic reactions. But now the mosquitoes are resistant to quinine.
Interesting.
So that's gone the way of the dodo bird. Right. And I can have tonic. It's not a problem. But you need much stronger medication now. And
of that, do you drink gin?
I do drink gin, sure.
But you're a tequila person.
I'm a tequila. I would say like my first choice of spirit these days is tequila. I love tequila, but I will happily drink gin. My sort of quasi roommate, Tom Colicchio, who I spent a lot of my year with because of Top Chef and other things, is a serious gin drinker, and he has a gin and tonic. When we're at judges' table, and that's our thing. So he got me into drinking gin and tonics for sure.
I'm a huge fan. I can't really find a lot in that whole category that I don't like.
Yeah, me too.
But I'm a fan. But you also did mention somewhere that you like a cocktail, and I want to say that it was made with rye. So it would have to be like an old-fashioned?
I like an old-fashioned with rye. Rye is also very Canadian.
Right.
In Canada, the quintessential drink that's like equivalent here of the like the vodka soda or the most ubiquitous drink is a rye and ginger ale.
Well,
that is the most Canadian, bar drink you can imagine. Right. So rye and ginger. We just call it rye and ginger, and that's the most Canadian drink. So I grew up drinking a lot of rye and ginger. From a reasonable age.
Yes, understood.
But the drinking age in Canada is far younger than it is here.
Okay.
So let's say from 18, I was drinking rye and ginger, but I do love an old fashioned.
Yes.
And I like it with rye as opposed to bourbon, although I'll happily have it with bourbon.
Me too. Now let's cut.
I'm very open and that's right.
We have a huge agreement and overlap on how we feel about food and drink.
Yes.
And travel. which we'll talk about.
Yes.
But just going back to where we left you in Montreal, you go food and writing, and then you uprooted yourself and moved to New York.
Yes,
at a young age.
I did. At 22, I got a job please, we're going to eat.
Yes, we're eating while we're talking because that's what we do.
That's right. I wrote a book called Talking with My Mouth Full because that's what I do. So at 22, when I moved home and didn't know what to do with myself, I got a job as an intern at the City Magazine of Toronto, kind of like New York Magazine or Boston Magazine, called Toronto Life Magazine. Excellent publication, award-winning publication. And I was their intern, so I was doing research and fact-checking and doing anything the editors wanted. And I found myself very drawn to the food editor, and I loved him. And I started doing little writing pieces for him. And then I got a job as an editorial assistant at a new, very fancy newspaper that had just launched in Canada called the National Post. And again, there I was working for the entertainment section, the food, travel, lifestyle section. And I was just drawn to the food editor and the food writers, begging them to let me go with them to restaurants and talk about food and write about food with them. And finally, the food editor said to me, after about 8 months on the job, I know you want to write about food. If you're really serious about food, go learn about food. Anyone can write, right? That's why you have editors. Everyone can learn to write. But if you have a beat that you feel strongly about, whether it's politics or war or sports, you can't do it from your couch. That's right. You need expertise. You can't write about the war without going to the Gulf, so to speak, right? Or you can't write about politics from home. You need to go to DC or, in my case, Ottawa, but very much less exciting in a good way these days. But so that's what I did. And that was sort of my tip off. I took his words to heart and I packed my bags and moved out of my parents' basement to New York City. And I enrolled in full-time culinary school.
That's a bold move.
Well, I was at the time when I could do it. There are a few times in your life when you are an adult enough that you are allowed to do those things, but a child enough that I had no other responsibilities, and I found a way to live in one of my best friend's apartments, basically in what was considered a second bedroom, but in anywhere else in the world would have just been called a closet. And I paid him $500 a month. He was a banker, and he was happy to have me there. And he made a living that could afford that. And so I moved in and I didn't leave his apartment for almost 2 years. And I moved to I always knew I wanted to live in New York, at least somehow, some way, for a short period of time. The issue with moving to New York at 22 is that you get here and then you realize you're in New York and you never leave.
Yeah, that does happen.
A lot of people. It happens to a lot of people.
I started here and I haven't left.
Right, well.
You know what I mean?
Because you knew from the beginning.
Well, I'm not sure that I knew. I just somehow it worked out well.
For sure. Your life grew here.
And when you're in New York, somewhere in your early experience, you have two kind of formidable, I'll call them mentors, but even you can decide what they are.
They are.
But they are. Okay, so you connected and worked with both Jeffrey Steingarten and Daniel Ballou, right?
Yes, correct.
All right, so how did it come to be? But what did you take from that experience?
Right, a lot of things. They are still very much. We're eating potato chips, and I'm scared to eat it because it's going to make such a loud noise in the microphone.
The noise. People should know that on a show about deliciousness,
we're going to eat.
There's going to be food involved.
These are really good potato chips. The Spaniards, these are Spanish potato chips. Spaniards make the best fried potatoes in the world. I'm just saying it and putting it out there. We can say what we want.
These are flavored with truffles.
Yeah,
which is really
it's not terrible.
No, nothing wrong with that.
So, to make it as quick as possible, I went to culinary school. I knew I didn't want to be a chef. I went to culinary school to learn the language of the kitchen so that I could then write about it with some authority and differentiate myself from every other person who wanted to write about food. And then I graduated culinary school, and my culinary school convinced me that I still didn't know anything about food yet, and I shouldn't just leave culinary school and go to writing.
Right.
That if I really still wanted to kind of solidify my knowledge, I needed to work in a kitchen.
Right.
So I took their advice begrudgingly, and I went to work in two big kitchens in New York. I worked at Le Cirque 2000, which in the 90s was arguably the kind of greatest show on earth.
Right.
And a 4-star extraordinary moment in New York fine dining. And I worked there for a while. Hardest job of my life. Can I swear on this show?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hardest fucking job of my entire life.
Yeah, I hear you. Because why? What makes it so brutal to be in the kitchen?
Well, it was a very demanding kitchen. It was a very big kitchen. I was the only woman in the entire savory kitchen. And, my hours were sort of noon to midnight, 6 days a week. This is standard. I mean, I'm not saying anything that was unusual, but I was 22. I didn't really know anybody. And you work very hard. And when you are the lowest rung on the proverbial culinary ladder, you're just doing the grunt work, right? It's manual labor. I mean, there's very little difference to doing construction. That's not entirely true. I mean, it definitely takes skill, but you're cutting and lifting and schlepping and standing over fire for 10 hours a day. Right. And I knew that's what I was doing. I'm not complaining about it. I'm just giving you the statistics of what I did. And so it was very hard work. And you don't use your head a lot. You're sort of just in your head alone for hours and hours every day because you're just executing.
Right.
But it gave me muscle memory, and it taught me an enormous amount about running the inner workings of a high volume restaurant kitchen like that. Mm-hmm. And then I left there and I went to another kitchen that's no longer around called Vong, which was Jean-Georges Vongerichten's Thai-inspired restaurant, kind of the first of its kind, an incredibly trailblazing restaurant at the time. Uh-huh. Beautiful ingredients, much smaller kitchen, but still a 3-star excellent kitchen. I was still the only woman in the kitchen.
Wow.
But I loved that kitchen.
Right.
Because the crew, the team, was just killer. I mean, they were a bunch of hooligans, but they were fun and fast, and they cared about me. They paid attention to me. Sweet. They taught me. I have memory of 3 or 4 of the guys in that kitchen who just taught me a lot about food and cooking. And I got to use all of these ingredients that I had never, ever seen before, that you certainly don't get in French culinary school. Things like sea beans and edamame paper and Szechuan peppercorns and all of those things, and coconut milk, all these things. So anyway, my time at Vong was great. I'm working there. My shifts there were actually a little better. I worked lunch service 4 days a week, which meant I had a bit of a life. But still, you get home at night after cooking a long day and you can't really go right to sleep. It's like leaving your work at 6 p.m. and going right to sleep. You can't do that. You're wired. Lots of people get into a lot of trouble that way because they go out after their shift and do a lot of drinking. But I didn't want to do that. I went home and I read a lot of books because I'm a bit of a nerd. And so I read a lot because I was alone late at night. Right. And one of the books I read was a book called The Man Who Ate Everything by Jeffrey Steingarten. Mm-hmm. And he's the food critic at Vogue magazine. And this was when he was really in the prime of his writing career. He's a multi-award winning, really brilliant writer. I would argue one of the great food writers of our time, living food writers of our time, and long form, very in-depth research on all sorts of things: ingredients, cultures, dishes, history of food, anthropology of food. And I realized that's what I want to do. Not be Jeffrey Steingarten, but be his assistant. In the book, he talks about his assistant. And she was doing all of those things, and that's exactly what I wanted to do. Right. And through a series of very serendipitous events, he was looking for an assistant. I tracked him down. I begged for the job. I did an interview, and I got the job. Wow. So I went to work for Jeffrey. And that really, it's hard to say what was the moment in your life that sort of put you on the path that you're now on. And there's obviously so many factors, but that job really was, to me, everything. He taught me everything I know about food writing, about research, about, journalism for sure, but also about food. He introduced me not only to the most incredible people in the food world all over the world at the time. He had Pierre Hermé, the greatest living pastry chef, come to his house on a regular basis to cook with us, and Alice Waters and Danielle Boulou and, Ruth Reichel. Everyone was in and out of there. He would take me out with them. He was traveling a ton. And then we were cooking all the time. We would make pizza dough for 2 months straight just to perfect the perfect dough. We would make coq au vin for a month straight. We would test the bricks, the sugar level of peaches, from, every major peach grower in America. We had this amazing budget, which doesn't happen anymore. Right. And we did it all. Right. So he was not an easy man to work for. Right.
Because he was demanding.
He was demanding.
Perfectionist, I'm sure.
Correct.
But it was like going to university.
It really was.
What a great thing. And by the way, the question I want to ask you here has nothing to do with food. It has to do with the fact that what advice would you give your own children in a situation like that, where they can identify something that they want? Look what it is that you did. You went for it. Like you really literally. How would you describe, if you were giving advice to your own kids, how would you basically summarize the
takeaway?
Yeah. Not what you took away, but how you went.
Right, that's what I mean. Wow, I mean, I guess I would say focus, drill down what it is you want to do, but be open to the possibilities of how to do it. Because I never in a million years knew, I didn't come to New York with that goal. I only learned about Jeffrey when I got here, and I certainly never imagined I could get that job. It was really about being narrow enough that you have an opinion, that you have a focus, a semi-formed focus.
A sense of the direction.
Sense of direction. But always know that you can get to the end point, or I don't even want to say the end because it's never ending, but you can get where you want to go in a million different ways. Right. And to be open to all of those possibilities and really just to say yes all the time. Say yes. When as long as you're not being taken advantage of.
Sure.
You know, that there's, I don't know, it's a terrible term. There's a million ways to skin a cat. Is that the term? I don't know where that term comes from. That's terrible.
I believe it's a term. Yeah.
But whatever
There's
point
more than
is,
one way to get where you're going.
That's right. And I didn't know. I didn't have a 10-year plan. I knew I wanted to learn about food writing. That's all I knew. And here I was through working in that kitchen. I could have never gotten the job with Jeffrey had I not worked in those kitchens, because he needed someone with skills and knowledge beyond just the kind of textbook culinary skills. Right. He wanted someone who could fight back a little bit, who had a thick skin, and who could put their head down and do the research.
And also someone who was a good student.
Yes.
In other words, he couldn't have hired just anybody. You had proven yourself already to be someone who was good at understanding how to do
diligent.
That's
right.
I love that.
And it was actually what happened after Jeffrey. Mouth is full.
It reminds me. I'm going to go grab a chip while we're
do that.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, I mean, he set me up for everything to come after. I don't think that if I hadn't worked for Jeffrey, I could have done anything that I did after. When I worked for Jeffrey for 2 full years, which is about the amount of time you can work for Jeffrey.
You can do it right.
Because then you need to move on. You're exasperated. He needs some fresh blood.
Right.
You know, it's just an assistant job.
Right.
And so, simultaneous to my time at Jeffrey coming to an end, a few things happened that formed my future. One, 9/11 happened. And I was living in New York, a Canadian, remember, dependent on a visa that was dependent on my employer.
Right.
And so when the towers fell, obviously New York was thrown off kilter, still is arguably, and the world changed, but certainly the world of publishing changed very, very quickly. And not only were jobs shrinking and publishing changing and the world of magazines sort of contracting, but no one was hiring an immigrant, right? So I needed to find a new job and had no idea who was going to trust me. You know, I was still a junior person. I wasn't going to become an editor-in-chief now. So how was I going to convince someone to hire a junior editor to work in a test kitchen or work for a magazine or any sort of publication, but also to get me a visa to do so, which is a double extra tenuous situation around that time. And I interviewed with a million people and I got several really interesting job offers. But as soon as I said, and I need a visa, they said, sorry, can't do it. Jeffrey was very helpful to me. And one of the people who he had come to introduce me to and who I had come to know through the course of my time with Jeffrey was Danielle Boulou, who is one of the greatest chefs in New York, greatest chefs in the world. Now he has something like 12 restaurants all over the world. But when I met him, he had 3 restaurants in New York City with 3 more planned on the way, Las Vegas, Palm Beach, and another in New York, and had 3 books about to happen, was working on, you know, a knife line and a product line, and all of these things were about to happen for him. And he needed to expand his team. And I had met him several times with Jeffrey, and he'd always sort of taken pity on me, as a lot of people did when I was in that job.
Because they knew that you were working for someone who was kind of a taskmaster in a way, right?
Correct. Yeah. But they also knew that Jeffrey didn't hire dummies.
Right.
So I went to meet with Danielle. He offered to sit down with me for 20 minutes of the time, which in that was, more than I could have ever imagined. And he offered to sit down with me and his marketing director, Georgette, at the time, to just brainstorm with me about what I could do next. Not about finding a job with him, because remember, my goal, the door I wanted to walk through was into a food magazine full time.
Right.
And after about half an hour talking, he and Georgette said, well, we wish we could hire you because we're looking to expand. We have all these projects, book projects, events, restaurant openings. And this would be great, but we're not hiring right now. So they introduced me to a couple of other people and I went about my way, but things didn't come through. And about 3 months later, Georgette called me and said, are you ready now? And I said, yeah, I'm here. I'd love to work with you guys, but I need a visa. And he was the first person to say, yeah, no problem. I'm French. I have basically an immigration lawyer on retainer because half my kitchen is from all over the world.
Nice.
Just come work with me. Don't worry about it.
Beautiful the way that happened.
And thank God. And he really became my fairy godfather, Danielle Blue.
Love that. Love that.
And my MBA. When you asked before what you took away from that, he taught me the business of restaurants, because up until that point, my career had been either in kitchens or working for Jeffrey, which was extraordinary, but a completely unrealistic scenario. Right. I had no idea who was paying for any of it, who was paying for the foie gras and lobsters I was cooking in the restaurant, who was paying for the extravagant trips that Jeffrey was taking and our never-ending budget for books and research and trips and ingredients. So I was getting all of this experience, but nothing was actually grounded in the economics of restaurants,
the running of
a business.
Right.
And that's where Danielle came in. Even though it was a very, very fancy business, it was a small team, and I was working with everyone from the CFO to the busboys.
That progression worked perfectly for you. And at some point, I'm going to assume you made it over to the food magazine world.
Yes, because here I am. Yes, interestingly, the Danielle job, I will say, when he offered it to me, I was hesitant a little bit because, my goal was not to go work for a chef. That seemed a bit incongruous to what I thought was going to be my plan. But when Danielle Blue offers you a job, you just take the job.
Yes.
And so that was that example of kind of making this sharp left-hand turn, knowing that whatever I was going to do for him, I was going to learn. And he was an amazing man and his team was extraordinary. And it was definitely a detour, but I knew that it was just worth doing. And it was definitely the other door. It was the door to the left. It wasn't the door straight forward, but I knew I could get there. And get there I did. I worked for him for 3 years doing all of these things with him and his team. And then I had come to know through Danielle all of the people at Food and Wine magazine because Danielle worked with them very closely. He was a Best New Chef, which is a big award they bestow every year from their very first class in 1988 when they first started giving out the award. And so we did events with them all the time, invited them to things. I worked with them on a number of projects. And one guy who I had worked with a bit at Food and Wine came to an event at Danielle one day and pulled me over. And he actually said 2 things to me. He said, one, who is that smart, beautiful woman behind the front desk? Because I would like you to introduce me to her. Not in a creepy way, in a very gentlemanly way. He said, I saw her at a restaurant last week. What are the chances? And here she is. It must be fate. Who is this woman? And I'm leaving Food and Wine. I'm going to open my own restaurant. Would you want my job at Food and Wine?
Wow.
And I was like, I'll scratch my back if you scratch you. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. So I introduced him to the woman who at the time was our head reservationist, who went on to become the first female maitre d' of any 4-star restaurant in New York. Her name is Maite Montenegro. And I introduced him to Maite. They dated, got married, and now they have 2 children, and they live in San Sebastian.
How do you like that?
So that worked out for both of us.
Yes.
Because he simultaneously introduced me to Christina Gurdovich, the then VP of Marketing, who went on to become the publisher of Food and Wine.
Right.
And Christina hired me into his job.
That's unbelievable. I love that. I didn't know
Yeah.
any of that.
That was that.
I love that story. Now,
and that's how I got to Food and Wine.
And as long as we're here at this point, even though I want to ask you about some of the global travels, we'll keep it in sequence.
Yeah.
Because at some point...
I'm still not even on TV yet.
No,
but it comes shortly after.
Well,
it's not the longest story in the world.
That's what I'm saying. Is like I feel like at this point, what I would like to segue into is how are you introduced to this idea, this television program called Top Chef? Like, how did that one come to be?
Well, so I went to work for Food and Wine.
Sure.
I didn't really know what I would be doing there. it turns out I went there to run part of the marketing department.
Sure.
Which was interesting, but not necessarily what I thought I was going to be doing when I got there. And that was a great transition. And I learned actually that although my goal had always been to write about food, what Danielle also taught me when I worked for him is that I actually really liked being around people.
Right.
And when you're writing, you're not really around people as much. And so working for a food magazine, but in the marketing side. So I was kind of combining my business experience, marketing, public relations, and I was kind of being with people more and being out there sort of promoting the magazine. That was what really got me. And that's what I really loved about it. And about a year into the job, I transitioned into the role of running the Classic in Aspen. The woman who had been doing it went on maternity leave and decided not to return. So Christina gave me the job. And very shortly after I started that job, working on the Classic in Aspen, which was, a full-time, amazing job, Christina also got a call from Bravo. Now, Bravo Network, TV network at the time, was a very different network than it is now. This was pre-Housewives, pre-Top Chef, pre-Project Runway. They had just launched Project Runway. And the first season of Project Runway had become a hit. And they thought, well, this is great. It was sort of, Project Runway grew out of the success of Queer Eye. A lot of people don't know that when Bravo had Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, the original version, it was such a groundbreaking piece of television that Bravo decided every single thing we're going to do from here on is going to be in one of the 5 verticals of one of those fabulous 5 guys.
One of which was food.
Right. So there was fashion, food, beauty, grooming. That's beauty. Fashion, food, beauty, home decor, and culture, pop culture.
Got it.
So Project Runway was their first project off of that, and that was the fashion. And they made this food competition show, and it was a huge success. And they thought, okay, now we're going to roll out that exact same show, but in the food space.
Right.
Problem is, Bravo didn't know anything about food. So they came to Food and Wine and said, we have this idea for a show. Would you partner with us? Teach us about the world of chefs and food. We want to make a true show about real chefs and discovering the greatest new young talent in the industry. If you can teach us about that, we will take one of your editors, one of the people from the magazine who, if we like one of them, and put them at the judges table, which was a new concept, this judges table.
Right. Nobody had that.
Right.
That before.
Representing the magazine.
Right.
To give the show credibility, to, cross promote each other. And our editor-in-chief wasn't thrilled with the idea because reality television was very new. Right. And this was a crapshoot. It was very hard for magazines to get the reach of television. Magazines were always trying to get on television to figure out how to capitalize on television, but you also don't want to dilute your brand. In television is much more broad. The thing about Food and Wine is a very elevated, affluent brand. So how do you maintain that integrity? Christina, our publisher, had the nerve to say, you know what, we got to do this because Bravo is a good network. Queer Eye, Project Runway, these are great shows. Tom Colicchio had signed on to be the head judge. Yeah. And she knew that was a good thing, that he was going to take this very seriously. We knew Tom very well. Right. I met Tom working back with Jeffrey Steingarten. So I'd known Tom for 10 years at this point. And that had nothing to do with me. None of these conversations had anything to do with me. I was running the Classic in Aspen. Christina came to me and said, we need someone to go audition for this show. And they sent a couple of other people as well from Food and Wine. Because I had been running a lot of the PR stuff for Danielle, Christina knew that I kind of knew the landscape a little bit I knew a lot of the kind of morning TV people, and I knew how to do cooking food segments, and I had a culinary background. So I had done, and I had done some on-camera cooking demos for Food and Wine, when the Today Show or New York One had called to talk about brand, trends.
You were comfortable doing being a public face?
Yeah, a little bit.
Right.
Not totally comfortable, Rob. Don't give me that much credit.
Fine.
I had dipped my toe in the water.
Right.
So she said, go try out. So I went. I had no idea what I was doing. Reality television scared the hell out of me. Sure. But it was my job. And Christina told me to do it, and I did whatever she wanted. I was her soldier, So I went up to 30 Rock, and I remember I sat in a closet behind it with a green screen, and a producer who went on to become my executive producer for many years came into this tiny room with a camera and just started asking me questions about food. And I answered the questions to the best of my ability. Right. And then I went back to my job at Food and Wine, and I forgot about the whole thing. And about a month later, Bravo called and said, tell Gail to pack her bags. We're starting to shoot in San Francisco in 2 weeks from now. And so I had no idea what I was doing, and I got ready and I went to San Francisco and we shot the first season of Top Chef, really not thinking it would be anything. We kind of shot it, thought, okay, now I'll just like go back to my life and go back to my job, and the rest would be history, which is what I did for a little while. And then the show aired, and
you can keep
okay, great. And the show aired, and it took a while, but it sort of took off. And that was season one.
Sort of took off.
Well, it took a while, is what I mean. It wasn't an instant success.
How many? Well, speaking of that, I mean, how many years have there been?
It's been 14 years, 16 seasons.
And so the thing about it is, if you, as someone who's a student of the genre, this is the most successful food program in the history of television by far. There's nothing.
I guess so. Yeah.
I mean, no, there's nothing that compares. I mean,
no.
you and I love.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was on public television for 35 years, but in terms of
it's a different reach. It changed the industry in a different way.
I mean, it's an unbelievable thing. So, and as it starts out, and you're doing it to your point of not giving you too much credit, it's got to be a little bit kind of almost intimidating in the beginning.
All of it. It happened in such a way. I mean, it was sort of a slow burn. So I had a little bit of time. We all had a little time, because television, one thing people don't know about Top Chef in particular, I can't speak for other shows, is that we shoot for sort of 6 weeks straight.
Right.
And then we're done. And the show then doesn't air for another 6 months.
Right.
And that's the schedule. There were times in our history where we were shooting 2 or even 3 shows a year, because then there was a moment when we were making 3 spin-offs of the show all at the same time. And so that took up a lot more of my time. But the first 4 years specifically, there was a buildup of Top Chef, and it happened subtly. It changed my life subtly, or what I thought was subtly. And then one day I turned around, and 3 years later, my life was completely different. I had to figure out and renegotiate my entire role at Food and Wine. I all of a sudden was a television person. I'd always been a magazine person. And I remember one day, probably on the 3rd season, I was talking to my executive producers about something, and they asked my opinion about a television question. And I was like, I don't know. I'm a magazine person. I have no idea what you're talking. I don't know anything about television. Right. And they were like, Gail, you're a TV person. Hate to say it, but you were on the #1 food show on television, and you've been making it for years now. Like, you have to get over yourself and just accept. You can be both, and I still like to think I am both. Now you can say you're a media person, but before, like back then, those things were still very separate.
Is it and the impact with an impact that kind of enormous, it changes your life, especially insofar as you become a public person, and of course there's got to be huge advantages to that, and there have to be downsides as well.
For sure, there are.
How do you kind of how do you deal with that? How do you balance that?
I would say most of it is very positive.
Right.
I'm on a show that I'm really proud of.
Right.
I have a crew and a team that I'm really proud of. We make honest television, and I really believe in what we've done. And I think Top Chef has set a standard and has furthered the restaurant and food industry, which was our goal. Because forget about magazine person versus TV person. I'm a food person first and foremost. It's always been about food for me. It's always been about food for Tom. And so what we're doing is about the food. It's about the chefs. And I feel really good about that. So by and large, the feedback and the way it's impacted my life has been very positive. It's allowed me to travel the world to places I would never have dreamed of going. It's allowed me to meet people and work with a team of people. It's allowed me to make more television that I love and more media and expand my platform and my reach to really be a champion and a cheerleader for the restaurant industry.
Right.
That, I think, is what I do. That's become my role in a kind of greater sense. And now I can do it in a bigger way than how I originally envisioned it when I left culinary school, which was just to be a food writer. Now that means 100 different things. And I think I am sort of a voice in the industry that is a champion of chefs, of young chefs, of female chefs, of our industry, of immigrants, of cuisines, of gathering around a table, of the way that food connects people. Like all of these things I can now have a platform to speak for and work with and connect all of us to the way we think about food in a different way. But sure, there's some downsides. I mean, becoming a public person wasn't ever anything I even thought about, right? That was like that was definitely a symptom. It wasn't a cause. Like I didn't plan on becoming famous, or my goal was never to be on television. So all of the stuff that happened on one hand was a bit surprising and unnerving at times.
Sure.
There are outcomes of that I didn't anticipate that can be a little bit strange and unpleasant. Unpleasant, not the right word. Yes, I have to be a lot more careful about my personal information. I am a private person, and with social media now, everybody is a public person, but I'm never going to be the person who documents every minute of my day, everything about my children.
Right.
I still like to separate my life. Like, yes, I play myself on television, but that is still an edited version of me. What you're going to see out in the public eye is an edited version of me. And that is fine, because I'm allowed to still have my private life. Absolutely. and that's okay. And I guard that truly, especially now that I have, in the course of this whole time, become a parent. And I'm very protective of that, because I'm protective of my quiet moments and my private moments. But at the same time, I love that it has allowed me access to a world that I never dreamed of being part of. And, the strangeness of it, being stopped on the street, people analyzing what I put in my grocery cart when I'm at the supermarket. There was also a time, I feel like the world goes in waves. There was a time when the Gawker Stalker and the paparazzi thing was a lot bigger. Right. And when we were shooting Top Chef, we would be followed. Right. And I would have to use different names when I checked into hotels. And, I had a few moments when I had to be careful of people who were trying to get access to me that I wasn't comfortable with, things like that. And there's always going to be haters. I remember the early days of Top Chef, when before there was like broad social media, there was like chat rooms on the Bravo website if people wanted to write in. Yeah. And after every episode, there would be hundreds of comments. Right. And I would say, all good. No, there are not. There's always no one is going to love what you do 100% of the time. Right. The truth is, you just got to keep on doing it, because you come to realize that for every ass out there who wants to comment about how ugly your ears are, literally those were the comments I would get about how.
I think your ears look very lovely.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think they're fine. I'm comfortable with my ears. Right. Everyone wants to change something about themselves, but by and large, I am happy with who I am. And for every one person who is a negative, rude, vicious, anti whatever you are doing person, there is 100 who are positive and who you impact in a great way. So you just got to step away from the noise, really, and just keep doing what you're doing as long as you think it's making a good impact on the world.
Now, for people
my friends, as you can hear from my conversation with Gail, we have some more things to cover, including I asked whether she's coming back for the next season of Top Chef. And what you can also hear from Gail is how much she really knows about food, from the beginning of her childhood through all of her professional experiences. She is a legit food expert, and obviously an on-camera talent and writer and all good things. So a pleasure to speak with her. But tune back in next week, and I'll play part 2 of my conversation with Gail Simmons. Until then, my friends, I would remind you that life is short, so never waste a meal.
I'm the Teflon Pan Man. I'm the Teflon Pan Man. Ain't nothing gonna stick on